I am Alexander James Hinton. It is July 21st of 2015, and I am interviewing Joann Detwyler,
My grandmother.
my grandmother. So, tell us about the circumstances of your birth. Where were you born? What year?
I was born in 1920 in Fairview, West Virginia. And my name was Ellen Joann, spelled Joan, Weaver.
Okay. What's your earliest memory?
I remember when my little sister was born. I was 5, and my brother was 6. That was 1925. She was born.
And how many siblings did you eventually have altogether?
3.
And what did your parents do in this town?
Well, my mother was a homemaker mother, and Dad worked in the oil wells. What he did, I think, was go and start and monitor wells, derricks that had been built up out in the town.
Okay. Did you guys stay in this town for their whole life? Did they retire there?
Yes. Both my parents lived there, both there. Mm-hmm.
So, you went to school in the town with your siblings as well?
I went to grade school, they called it. That was from grade 1 up to 8. I walked to school. Started when I was 5.
So you were only 10 or around 10 when the Depression started. What do you remember about the Depression?
1929. I just heard that today on the radio. Yeah, the Depression was very real. We never really felt poor because everyone else was poor too. So you made sure everybody had food and things that mattered. But the banks closed. I remember the banks closed. We had 2 banks in town, a Farmers and Merchants, and then a First National, a federal bank. And the banks would give you a little tiny bank to take home. And then when you got it full, you took it back and opened your account. And I remember when the bank going over there that week, getting our money back.
Do you remember as a child if your life changed drastically when this all began?
No, because everybody's life changed, and we weren't, it was a small town, there was no one very rich or very poor, so we just sort of kept on helping each other and just plain living.
So daily life continued normally, just going to school every day. Did you do any sports or any clubs or anything like that?
Well, school, we had the Girl Reserve. I was in that, and then the church.
What is Girl Reserve?
Well, it's just sort of like a 4-H club or something like that. Learning to do good, be good. Then we had, through the church, we had young people's unions. I always went to young people's clubs.
Were girls allowed to play sports, or did they play sports?
We did have sports. We played basketball. Mm-hmm. That was high school. Of course, we went to high school.
And that was the school, not the church basketball?
That was silly. That was school.
Well, tell me about your school. Was it a big school, or was it fairly small?
We had one class for each grade, and we had teachers, mostly women teachers, and from 1 to 8, I had 2 men teachers, one in 6th grade, and the principal in 8th grade, and he was a real interesting figure. He was a big, tall man, very intelligent, very rigorous. You did the right thing, and you never cheated, and you did the work.
Was he the principal?
He was the principal, and he taught math.
Ah, okay.
But I had good teachers, real good teachers.
So you said earlier you only had one class. Does that mean you only had one classroom for each grade?
One classroom for each grade.
And different teachers would come into the classroom and teach different subjects, or was it?
No, the same teacher taught everything.
Okay. What were the hours on school like? What time did you get there and what time did you leave?
Well, we walked to school. I think school probably started at 9. Then we went home for lunch at 12, and then back at 1, because everybody walked.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have buses. And it was strictly for our little community. It was not a consolidated school particularly, but for the lower grades, this is.
And was this a co-educational school? With
Yes.
boys and girls? Okay. What did you have a boyfriend when you were in high school? Did any of your girlfriends have boyfriends?
Yeah, I had my group of friends, and we had boyfriends, and we went to a different building now when we went to high school.
Okay. What was that building like?
Mm-hmm. It was built during those years, when I went to high school. That would have been, 1930-something. Anyway, my grandfather, Mr. Weaver, was very instrumental in getting the high school built. And it was a big stone building, and it had a gymnasium, and it was in a playing field, and it opened. I went there for high school. It was open then.
How would you describe your high school experience? Was it a fun time for you?
Oh yes, I had very good teachers, and we had a little of everything. But what we had was very well taught. The English teacher, for instance, was a very well educated teacher, so she taught us maybe a semester of Latin, maybe a semester of Spanish. But what she taught in English, I know my English because I learned it from her.
Oh.
And we had good teachers. So during those years, I had music. We had an orchestra. I played piano in the orchestra in high school to come for assembly.
So would you say your favorite subject was English then?
English and math. I like math.
How did it work with college? Were girls expected to apply to schools when they?
No, there was no talk then of people going to college. I think I told you once that the boy who always vied with me for the top grades, he went to college, but nobody even suggested that I go to college. So.
So what did people do then? Did they get jobs as early as 16, or?
They got jobs and got married. The girls got married.
So what did you do? What was your first job?
In Fairview, I didn't have a job. That was a miserable year after I got out of high school. I just stayed home and washed and ironed and cleaned and.
Waste of a great mind.
And the church in my youth was important because we had a good time in church. We had a Baptist, a Methodist, and a Church of Christ, and we had practically all the young people in town went to one of those. So it was a good time in my life.
Which church did you all attend?
I went to the Baptist.
Okay. So did you have to go down to the lake and be doused in the water?
No, in our church, they had a baptistry up under the altar, which when you was going to baptize, that big tub would be filled with water, and you would go down the steps, and you would be immersed. You'd wear a white dress, and this was when you were 12 years old. You usually formally joined the church. So.
Well, were there any big life events during this time, during your school years, that happened maybe in your family or your siblings or in the town at large? Or was it all pretty normal?
It was pretty normal. It was a nice. The town was a typical little town. I don't suppose the population was much more than maybe 2,000.
Wow.
But we had as I told you, 2 banks, and we had 2 doctors, and a dentist, and a grocery store. So it was a nice little town.
So what year did you graduate high school? 1938?
36.
36? Wow. Had you heard any talk about Adolf Hitler or Germany? Was there any talk about what was happening in Europe at this time?
At that time, no. I had civics, like we called it, and that was history. And so we knew about world, and then we had world events.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew what was going on, but nothing like international problems like Hitler.
Who was president at that time?
When I was born, it was Woodrow Wilson.
Right.
And I graduated, I guess it was 38. I don't know who was president then.
It must have been FDR, right? Because he was president during the end of the...
He was president for most of my life.
Yeah.
Well, he was president for, I guess, because after him was Truman. And I was in Washington by that time. It must have been FDR who was president when I was.
And FDR wasn't he famous for his fireside chats?
His what?
His fireside chats where he would get on the radio. Did your family listen to this?
Oh, yeah. We all liked FDR. We thought he was wonderful. He was doing a good job. And
So
we listened to him. And in fact, when we moved south, it was quite a shock to me to learn that the South did not like FDR. I couldn't imagine that no one liked FDR.
well, I guess West Virginia is not technically the South.
No.
Do West Virginians consider Virginia to be the South, the beginning of the South?
Yeah, Virginia was with the South.
Okay.
West Virginia was formed in 1863. So you see, that was sort of at the beginning of the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And they chose to become a state. They had 55 counties. I know a lot about West Virginia history. We had to study West Virginia history.
Well, it's a small state. Yeah, it's good to memorize everything in Canada.
Yeah.
So that year when you graduated high school and you said you didn't have a job, was that because of the economy, or were you given a year? Were your parents expecting you to get a job? What did they have? What kind of expectations did they hold for you?
Well, my brother is just a year older. He went to college. The boys usually went off to college, and all the girls. There was a teachers' college in a town nearby, and some of the girls went to the teachers' college. Or you tried to get a job, or you got married and had babies, and that I wasn't interested in that. So, but I did have I had friends and a couple boyfriends, and so it was just.
So, but what was your first job? When did you end up getting your first job? Or did you end up going to school first? Another school? Because you did end up going to secretary school or typing school.
But during high school, the town near us had a Murphy's store, and I would would work there on Saturdays. But Dad would have to take me in and bring me back, so so I knew what it was to work, and I didn't have any real jobs. There weren't any jobs. One time I had my cousin Helen lived in Fairmont, and she had a job with a small concern, and they had a vacation, and they needed somebody to work the telephones. The telephones had a big board where you plugged in the calls. So she managed to let me work there for 2 weeks, and I thought that was wonderful.
Oh. So when do you remember what year it was that you moved away from home?
Mm-hmm. From home or yeah, well, must have been, it must have been 39.
And how old were you?
If I graduated in 30, if I graduated in 38, I was 17 at the time. So I must have been 17 still when I moved away from home. Or 19. Went off to Parkersburg. It was like a junior college, but it was a business college.
And where was that located?
Parkersburg, West Virginia.
Oh, okay. And how was that? How long how long were you expected to stay in school there?
Well, in that type of school, you stayed until you finished the course, which really was sort of like a junior college. You had math, shorthand, and typing. In those days, you didn't have shorthand and typing in school, and then you'd have accounting and some little history and English. It was very good. It was one of the best years of my life because for the first time, growing up in a small town, the churches, we didn't do much in the way of having parties, and I never danced. Mm-hmm. So when I got down to Parkersburg, it was a small group, I can't remember, but it was one group at a time. It was a class. Must have been 40 or 50 maybe. But anyway, I met new people, new kids, and best of all, we danced. And I found I could dance now. I loved to dance.
Oh, that's great.
And they had, the little school they had one sorority and one fraternity. And so that was another little social gathering, and that was...
Did you join the sorority?
Mm-hmm, and that was a bunch of, real nice bunch of girls, and we had a good time.
Do you remember the name of the sorority?
Alpha Iota. It's still in existence. It was a nice one. I don't remember the name of the boys, but there was... but it's still in existence. I saw something about it in the news. They were holding their national convention or something, and that was the name of the Alpha Iota. It was fun.
Now, was underage drinking a thing back then, or were people very...
Well, you could drink what they call 3.2 beer, but it didn't worse. But I'm sure there was as much drinking probably as people wanted.
Yeah.
And smoking.
Mm-hmm. That's what young people do.
They, and same thing. The young people were the same.
So you learned how to type and do accounting, and these are the type of job skills that you were hoping to learn at Parkersburg?
Mm-hmm. And I was good.
Mm-hmm.
If I say so myself, I was.
Of course you were.
A very fast typist and so I did the work in a short time, and I was free to get a job. So I got what was a choice job, secretary to a judge, Judge Sudan was his name, and I was paid $10 a week.
Now, where was this job located?
Parkersburg.
Parkersburg, okay.
And
this was during school or after you graduated?
I had finished school.
Okay.
I got this. It was a choice job because jobs were hard to get. And
do you remember what year this was? Was this 1939?
All this must have been in 39. It all runs together because I must have come to Washington in 40, late 40. So this must have been late 39. Well, I didn't tell you that in order to go to college, Bob had gone to university and he didn't like it. So his second year, he didn't go back. So when this offer came about the business college, finally decided if we could get the money, he had to go with me and take his business course, which he did. So he was and we had to live together because Dad had a little pension, $75 a month. And that's all they could afford. I mean, they couldn't afford any tuition costs or anything.
Right.
So if we went, we had to live together, cook, take care of ourselves on that $75, which we did. So we always had rented like little lighthouse keeping rooms, and we'd cook and take care of ourselves. And we both had a good time. He made good friends, and I had good friends.
Would you say you and your brother were very close then, especially at that time?
Well, we always were fairly close because we were only a year apart, so it seemed like that. But we each went our own way. I made my friends, and he never did do the dance part, but I did. I liked that.
Was he a big sports person or anything like that? Okay. How was the relationship with you and your siblings with your parents? Were they very proud of you? Were they worried about Bob?
Well, they weren't worried about Bob. Bob was the oldest, and they were very, very proud of him. He did all right in business college. He took the accounting. I don't think he ever had to take shorthand or anything. So.
Now, 1939 was also the year. I might be wrong on this. I think this is the year that Hitler invaded Poland.
Mm-hmm.
become more news coverage of that in the United States. Do you remember in the early stages what it felt like to see these headlines from Europe? Did people not even discuss them? Were they just sort of...
Oh, it was known, it was discussed, but it wasn't like we were at war or that they were even at war.
Nobody could have imagined
Nobody
what it
could
would become.
imagine it was war. It's just,
Okay. So you were living with Bob, and you had your job for the judge.
So anyway, the judge, I got this job for the judge for $10 a week, but in just a matter of months, I got an offer of a better job in Sears and Roebuck in their office at $13.50.
Wow.
So of course,
Was that $13.50 a month?
A week.
A week. Okay.
No, it was a month. A month. So of course I took the $13.50.
Was that considered a good amount of money? $13.50
Yeah.
a month? Wow. Okay.
So you have to train yourself to think of money in pre-war terms.
Pre-inflation, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And in order for us to go to college, Mother had a brother who lived in Texas, and I give her great pride in this and great strength. She had the nerve to ask her brother if he would loan her money that we could go to school. And he loaned us $500, and so we could go.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And that because I paid the tuition, and then we had the $75 to live on.
Right.
So it was really a fun time. And then also in Parkersburg, Dad had a brother who lived there and he had two sons about the same age as we were. But they had gone to college and moved away. And my aunt she had never had a daughter, and she was wonderful to me and would have me over to dinner. I had a lot of invitations out to dinner. That's why I ate so well. But they were, so when we went to sorority, had a tea like they do. She invited us to use her house. So I had very good, and they were, Uncle, he was very musical. He played the banjo. And I think this is my start in classical music. He only played classical music. He was an interesting man. He was very intelligent. And so when you played music, you listened. You didn't play classical music and talk and chat or anything. You listened. And he only played classical music on the banjo. I think that was sort of my beginning of realizing that classical music is something special.
Yeah, that's an early age to gain an appreciation for classical music. You weren't even 20 years old then.
Oh, but in high school, we had, on the radio, there was a classical music program, I think, either once a month or once a week for an hour. And we would go and listen to the classical music. It was a national program. I've forgotten the name. It was quite well known. And they played good music and told us about it. So I had a fair introduction to classical, not really understanding what classical music was, but just it was nice, good music.
Was that unusual though among your friends? Were your friends more into the dance music of the time period?
We all like music. As I said, nobody danced though in our town. We had all the that's why I know all the popular songs. We listened to the golden age songs on our radios.
Right.
And we had a glee club in school. I mean, everything that you have in a good school, just a sample of it. But with good teachers, they instilled a lot of good things into us.
So, you left being the secretary of the judge for the Sears Roebuck.
Sears Roebuck. So then, while I was in the business college, you could take the government exam for a test for a job in Washington. So I took the secretarial exam, and then you're notified later on whether or not you passed it, and then later on that you might get a job offer.
Well, what was entailed in this secretarial exam? What sort of things did they ask you?
It's just like a real intelligence test, just like.
Well, it's like an IQ test or
Mhm.
abstract thought and
Yeah,
math.
yeah, like any job application test. Your background, who you were, and then.
You didn't have to demonstrate your typing skills.
Oh, well, yes, you had to have proof of your typing skills.
Okay.
Because you either could apply for a stenographer's job or a file clerk, and that was the very lowest entry job into the government. Or you could get the secretarial, which was a higher grade, higher pay. So,
Okay.
so then I got the job offer from Department of Agriculture. So I didn't stay at Sears more. This whole thing, they all ran together because they all happened in a short time.
You were a very busy woman.
That was busy.
So were you excited? The job offer was for a job in D.C., right?
In D.C. at $14.40. That's the basic salary. That's $120 a month. So going from my $13 a month to $120 was heaven.
Were you at all frightened of moving to D.C., or were you just all full of excitement?
No, I remember my mother saying to me when getting on the train, because I had to go home, I had to quit my job in Parkersburg, go back home. I remember her saying to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" I told her, I said, I was never sure of anything in my whole life. Got on the train, came to Washington.
That's very brave of you. Did you live alone, or did you have a roommate?
No, there was from the same college. She knew somebody who had gone to Washington before me, and I lived at a boarding house on 16th Street, and so I called, and they arranged to get me a room with this girl on 16th Street.
And this is still 1939 when you took your job here. Okay.
It was a boarding house.
So what was it like working in the Department of Agriculture? Was it a big office, a large office work staff?
No, you go you're usually like in the typing work, into a pool, or else you get assigned to a regular job. And I've told you the story of how I came into agriculture and met Carl, haven't I?
You met him at a dance, is what I heard.
Mm-hmm. No.
No?
No. When you accept a job, you file your regular government application, you put your picture on it. And it comes into the government office and they pick out the ones they want. Well, mine came into agriculture, and Carl was working as a messenger, which is the very lowest thing you can possibly do in the government. And he and his friend, both messengers, they would see the applications when they came in, and they would decide which ones they wanted to bring into agriculture.
That would be they were in charge of that? They would just select the
they were
prettiest
boys,
girl?
they were just boys looking at the application and looking for the girl. Well, Carl picked me. He really did. He picked me. So when I came, I was assigned to agriculture and was in started out in a regular job. And the boys, he and his friend would come by and say good morning to me. And I would blush. I'd blush and just be so embarrassed. But eventually he worked up enough courage to ask me to go out.
Oh.
But then I had real good jobs in agriculture. My first job, I was secretary to the director of personnel. And then I was promoted pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So that was
What were the office politics like? Did you feel like it was unfair that there weren't a lot of women as bosses or managers? That there wasn't a career track?
I don't remember that I ever worked for a woman who was higher than I was. In a managerial level. I don't remember it. There must have been very women. Claude Wickard was Secretary of Agriculture at that time, and I worked in his office as one of 3 secretaries. I was good, so I got good jobs with the officers, and I stayed there till. And then the war came. See, in 41.
Right. But so this is the time between. So you got your job in '39.
Mm-hmm.
You met Paul. You met Carl Detwyler, and then you started dating.
Mm-hmm.
So when did it become serious? When did you feel that you might? Because you had had boyfriends before. What was different about Carl? What were your first impressions of Carl?
Oh, he and his friend and one of the girls, we would go. They would ask us go out to the foursome, but I liked him and he liked me, and we did a lot of. That's when we did so many things. Like there were free concerts in Washington. You could do a lot with no money, and we had no money.
Mm-hmm.
But you see, he turned 21 in February of.
Okay, it's the beginning of the second side. We were talking about Carl Detwyler.
Now I'll start with I arrived in Washington in '39 with a job in the Department of Agriculture as a secretary. And I was 19, not 19. And we're there. That's where I met Carl. I worked in the secretarial pool, and Carl and his friends would watch the young girls, and eventually they'd ask us out for a date. And in Washington, so Carl and I started talking, I guess, and flirting.
Right.
And as I was saying, we had no money because he was an assistant messenger, which made even less than I did.
Mm-hmm.
So we really took advantage of Washington. We had a wonderful time. We went to concerts. We went to all the museums. Everything that was free, we went to. Good concerts
So this must have been a very fun time of your life.
Mm-hmm.
This must have been a very fun time of your life if you
It was very.
things to go.
And then, as I started to tell you, in 1941, in February, he turned 21. So he was drafted immediately because he was young, male, single. Theoretically, you were drafted for a year, just a year.
Right.
So we saw each other all during that year, and he immediately was assigned to Fort Lee, Virginia. And then...
was this where he had to go for his basic training?
Mm-hmm. No, that was for basic training. Yeah, basic. And then he came back to Fort Belvoir.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in November, say, and that must be when we decided that in our day, you didn't sleep together if you weren't married. You didn't live together. So
right.
We wanted to live together, so we decided we'd get married.
Okay.
When his first weekend off, and that was December. So we got a license, and I said, well, I at least want to be married by a minister in a church. So
wait, did your parents know that you were going to get married to this man?
No.
Had they met him before?
Mm-hmm. All this, everything you see was, in those days, everything took place slowly but compressed together.
It sounds like it didn't happen slowly, like it happened very quickly.
Mm-hmm. It happened quickly.
So Paul was 21 and you must have been 20.
Mm-hmm. I was almost 21 because we got married in December and I was 21 that month.
So there was no engagement period?
Oh, no engagement. I think that was what Catherine said. Well, did your parents come? Did you have a wedding? No, we didn't. We wanted to get married, so we got married. We called up, did all the...
Where did this desire to get married come from? Was it because of the war?
No, the war hadn't started. We loved each other. We wanted to be together.
Okay.
As I say, you didn't go and shack up over the weekend like you would today, but you just didn't. At least I didn't with my
right.
Baptist background.
Right.
So we got married and went to this First Baptist Church on 60th Street, the biggest church, and I called up the office and said I'd like to get married with Minister marry us. Well, it wasn't a big wedding, so he was kind of hesitant, but yes, he would marry us. And so we had my one friend I had who came from Parkersburg later, Beulah, we lived together. So she and Carl and I went to the church and got married.
Carl didn't have one of his friends with him? He didn't have a best man?
Just the three of us that went got married.
Did you have a ring? Did he have a ring to give you?
This ring we had bought in the best jewelry shop in Washington. We had no money, but I'm sure how we paid for it. So then after the wedding, we decided now this is Saturday. The war hadn't started yet.
Yeah.
This is Saturday. We decided, well, we'll go see wherever we can get a bus ticket. He only had a weekend off. Get either a bus or a train. We'll go where we knew for our money. Well, there was a bus that took us to Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
So we went to Winchester, stayed in a nice hotel. I remember we had steak, and the black server cut my steak for me. Well, then the next day was Pearl Harbor, and everybody was called back immediately. Of course, we only had money to stay maybe 2 nights,
Mm-hmm.
so we had to go home. So he had to go back to the Army.
So that must have been an emotional roller coaster for you. Marital bliss to then the fear of Paul having to go into the military for a big war.
Well, see, he was already in the Army. So he'd gone in the Army on November.
Right. Did he think he would be deployed? What did he think was going to happen?
Well, we didn't know. Nobody knew anything because he had been drafted for a year. So he was a draftee.
Mm-hmm.
And so nobody knew anything what your life was going to be on that Sunday, except that everybody had to report back to base.
Do you remember where you were when you heard the news?
We were in Winchester. We were there. We were there.
Just the two of you? Did you read the news or did you hear it on the radio?
We must have heard it on the radio or people talking because it was. So we came back to Washington, and he went to Belmore, and I went back to my room with Beulah.
What was the overall atmosphere like? Not only
everybody was tense, and everybody was confused. Nobody could believe this was happening. And then FDR came on the radio, and he was wonderful. That's the only thing we had to fear ourselves. So nobody had any idea what was going to happen. So.
But did the United States declare war the next day?
Mm-hmm. The next day.
What did you and those close to you think? Did anybody have any opinions on what might happen? Your parents, they had lived through World War I, for example.
Nobody had any conception of what we were going into on that weekend, or even that whole week. Nobody had any. Couldn't believe what was happening and knew what it meant.
Did people know much about Japan even at all? It was a far eastern nation. The United States had not had much contact with. Certainly its people hadn't.
As it turned out, though, there had been inklings that people should have suspected something that they didn't. But I don't remember Japan. No, it was a time because. And of course, Carl then, from then on, could only come home to see me.
Mm-hmm.
And I was still living with Beulah on weekends or every now and then, because they were all on alert. And I guess they all draftees suddenly become enlisted members of them. He was a private, so he was just a private.
Mm-hmm. But he didn't. He ended up not having to fight on the front lines. He was too valuable. His mind was too valuable, so they stopped.
He was even that month of that short time he was there as a draftee, he'd already been chosen to be the head of the company or whatever it was. And so then after the war actually started, he was promoted quickly because they reckoned he was smart.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure he was a lot smarter than some of the people with him.
Mm-hmm.
So he was promoted very quickly to each rank. First was PFC, Private First Class, and then Corporal, and then Sergeant, and then the biggest promotion he ever got, if he made General, when he made staff sergeant, you could live off the post.
Hmm.
So that meant we could live together. So then we rented an apartment, and he couldn't stay at home all the time, but he could come home.
Okay. Well, let's go back to the beginning of the war, right after Paul goes, back and is being put into the military system. What changed with your daily life, your day-to-day life? Was there a lot of changes? Did you have, with the fact that you couldn't buy certain food, you couldn't get as many items?
Yes, but that didn't happen immediately. But
right. Yeah.
That's all part of the war story. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And there were immediate changes in your employment. See, the government is a big place, a lot of people.
Yeah.
And everybody was confused and didn't know what was expected or what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And who was president?
FDR.
FDR. He took charge, but there was a lot of confusion. You didn't know what was going to hapen. So.
Well, did you still go out, go dancing and do things like that?
No. If he could come home as an enlisted man, it would just be like for 24 hours.
Right.
Then he had to go back.
So how did you and your friends follow the war? Did you listen to the radio? Did you follow the war
daily.
very religiously?
You lived the war daily. You do. You followed every engagement and everything the Germans did and everything we were doing, the English did.
Now, what about your brother Bob? Where was he at this time? How did the war affect him?
When we got out, finished the business college, and I got my job at Joann, we parted. We gave up our apartment living together because I had to move downtown. So he got a room, and he got a job ushering in the local theater. But he had already, he was a member of the West Virginia National Guard, so he was called up immediately.
Right.
And he went to Fort Benjamin, Harrison. And then he stayed with the same infantry group all through the war. And he never really had to fight either. They were sent to Alaska because they thought the Russians were going to come over that strip of land, between the So
you got lucky with the men in your life not having to go into bad fighting.
Mm-hmm. So he was in the war as longer than in the army because he was called up
and
stayed with that.
What did your father think of the war? Did he have any opinions on the matter?
Oh, not really. Everything was, all these things were happening, and nobody really knew what they were that were happening.
Your parents must have been scared, though, for you and your new husband and for Bob.
No.
No?
They weren't very happy that I got married without telling anybody.
Yes, what was their reaction to that? How did they feel about that? Did they send you a letter?
I sent them a telegram. No, they were decent about it, but in retrospect, now that I'm older, it must have been a shock. It must have been a bad thing to do.
Well,
but Carl didn't have any family. His mother was living in Arlington then, but she was older. And, well, you just didn't. And we were
star-crossed lovers.
Culture, yeah, we weren't culturally able to have a wedding or anything. People didn't. Where I lived, you didn't have big weddings like Carol.
But surely they would celebrate them at the church with the church community.
But I was married in the church. I mean, I'm married.
That's true. Yeah. So when did your parents meet Carl?
Well, they had been. See, that was December, and we went home for. I went home for Christmas because he couldn't. He was in the army. Then he got off, and so he went to West Virginia several times. Met them.
What do you remember about the war? Do you have any big notable memories about maybe hearing about D-Day or hearing about the bombings in Japan?
as I say, in Washington, in the government, that's why I'm so interested in everything. You lived every day, every bombing, everything, and D-Day was a great thing. That's what shocked me down here. June the 6th, we were having dinner, and I said, "Oh, this is D-Day." Well, they looked at me blankly. What was D-Day? I mean,
that's shocking for your generation. It's very shocking.
Yeah, we lived through D-Day and followed everything in your job and at home. So I stayed at the government till 44.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there all during the height of it. Where Carl was, what they were doing.
So speaking about Carl, he was in the Department of Defense. Did he have a security clearance? Did he know more about the war that he was allowed to tell?
Oh yeah. Well, he was in the war.
Yeah, he was doing the logistics.
He was in the, and he was again back to his being smart and being recognized. He was always got good assignments. Office assignments. And I remember he wore glasses, and I wonder now if that wasn't one reason he was kept. And he was always kept in Washington,
mm-hmm.
and he went to the War College in Washington, and that was the highest, most secret place you could go.
Right.
And he went there as an enlisted man, and then from there he went to OCS and became an officer.
Hmm.
Oh, he had clearances all the way through. And then in the Department of Defense, he had clearances. So he always had secret clearances.
Did he ever say anything about the goings-on of the war? Did he have anything to say about D-Day? Because that required an immense logistical effort, so he must have known something big was coming far in advance.
Everybody, and then not only that, but what he was doing at that time, they were sent up to Skyline Drive, in the wintertime, because, and what his job was, the last 2 weeks of basic training, his camp would have them, and they were training those boys, those recruits, for an invasion through Africa.
Mm. Okay.
Oh, he was, everything secret. He had a high-level job.
So, that's just fast forwarding a bit. So the war in Europe ends. That was a big day for celebration. And then, how much of what you knew about the war, because there were two separate theaters, did it all come in at once? Would you get news about the Pacific Front and the Eastern Front at the same time? Mm-hmm. Were you more personally invested in one of them? Did you have friends or family in one front as opposed to another? Or was it all, equally about all?
It was filled with tension in both theaters. The Japanese, we followed all that because the ships that were so bombed, and there were a couple. One boy, at least from my high school class, was on one of those ships. And everybody had some relative in that Japanese thing. Mm-hmm. And see, by that time we hadn't joined with England in Europe. But we were settling so from then on, then we started building up the European side, and we knew everything was going on. Especially this invasion through Africa was a big thing. That African campaign was bitter. That was Patton and all those. And
that was Rommel, wasn't it?
Rommel, and that's and D-Day was equally. We weren't aware of that they were planning D-Day, but everybody knew something was being planned.
Yeah.
And all the plannings, and everybody had. Carl's first cousin was shot down in a plane.
So when you all entered into the war, or the day after your wedding, when America declared war, did you and Paul have to do a quick study of who Adolf Hitler was and who the Nazis were and what the Japanese Empire was about? Were these things that you two had followed and knew about, or did you have to become educated?
Everything started then. That's when you became involved with.
But Adolf Hitler had been doing things in the late 30s.
And people knew it, but it wasn't big news. I mean, so what? He invaded his little country, Austria and everything, so what?
But surely taking France must have been a very big shock to.
But we knew
the United
everything.
States.
We followed everything, particularly in the government. And Carl being in the army, they were very much aware of everything. Because they never knew when they were going to be shipped out.
Right. I know that the British retreat at Dunkirk, I think it was, that was a big.
That was a big thing.
Yeah, that must have been covered a lot because America had close ties with England and to a lesser degree, I think, with France.
So everything was covered. Everything was covered fully. I mean,
right.
So why did the Washington Post? So.
Well, before Pearl Harbor, do you remember if people would debate you and your friends whether or not the United States should help out England and the rest or not?
Well, we'd have articles in the paper and talk about how they were suffering and all that, but not we weren't involved yet. So, we were very with it. That's why I can't understand my contemporaries when I meet here. Were living the same time that I was.
Right.
And to me, all this was war. To them, it was nothing. I mean, well, that's not quite true because I had friends, but they weren't intimately
DC.
involved in it.
Yeah.
What did I say? I made another one of my statements yesterday.
Oh, they didn't know about Pluto?
The one about Pluto, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the end of the war now. I'm curious, as somebody who has known about nuclear weapons my whole life, it must have been quite interesting to hear about 2 Japanese cities being erased from the map by the United States. Did people really understand what had happened?
Oh yes, that was a terrible thing. Everybody, again, you didn't know what to believe. We heard all the horror of it, and you just didn't know what to believe. The one side, it was theoretically it saved American lives, but it cost a lot. Well, all those things were. We lived it every minute, Alex.
Yeah.
Not just something you read in the paper. We lived that.
Actually, before the nuclear bombs were dropped, I don't know how this slipped my mind, but FDR died. What do you remember? What your thoughts were on FDR passing away in office?
Oh, it was a great shock. But then on the war side, it was even greater because it developed much later. But he had never shared any of those secrets about the bomb with Truman.
Right.
So Truman suddenly became president and had very little knowledge of any of these deep secret things.
Right.
And all those great secrets.
Were people trusting in Truman, or were they afraid that he might not know what to do?
Well, they grew to like Truman because he was so steadfast and steady.
Right.
And then we had during the war we had Eisenhower. Everybody trusted Eisenhower.
Yeah.
He was next to FDR, and
yeah. So he was a very popular figure. Okay.
But you just have to get the feel that our whole lives were involved, tied up in living through this war.
Yeah.
It was day to day, and living in Washington with the Washington Post, we knew everything that was published, and then all the story about the Japanese, and that's a whole other story about the war. Like the people who were.
So, let me ask you as a general question: what are your strongest memories of that wartime period? It could be of anything. It could be of reading a wartime event, or it could just be Pa coming home for a weekend. What are some of the things you really remember strongly from that time period?
Well, it was my life with Paul. That was the main thing. See, when he only could come home on rare weekends. When I worked in agriculture, I had a big job, so I was entitled to a parking space. Gasoline, of course, was very hard to get. So anyway, there were 2 men who lived out where we lived. take me in their car and use my parking space.
Hmm.
And I remember, this is a little aside, uh, they'd been married, they weren't old men, but they were probably in their 40s, where we were in our 20s.
Right.
And also, they would be so envious because I would get so excited because Carl was coming home for the weekend. And I could just see, they would think, why could I get that excitement out of their marriage?
Right, yeah.
Well, that was a big thing, the times we could be together.
It must have been, you two must have looked forward to those days.
Oh, yeah, my
Way in
parents
advance.
lived for that.
Yeah.
Just coming home.
Okay, so the war ends. Paul gets to come. Does he get to come home, but basically full time with you? You got a house.
Oh, after he made staff sergeant.
Oh, so did he make staff sergeant a while after the war had ended?
No.
Okay.
No, he made staff sergeant in the second year of the war.
Oh wow, that's pretty early.
Yeah, but up until that time, he only could come home on the weekends. But even with staff sergeant, he only could come home on the weekends. But he could stay with me.
And he got much better pay though, didn't he?
And he got yes, but then he didn't stay staff sergeant very long because he went to OCS. It was quite quite an honor to get to go to OCS.
Right.
And then of course he had to stay. That was in the winter. Everything he had to do was in the winter.
Right.
And so then he didn't come home at all. I lived in the apartment by myself then. And then when he got out of OCS, he was the second lieutenant. But then he came back and stayed at Belvoir quite some. In fact, he was always theoretically based at Belvoir in different parts of it.
Okay.
But he moved around, and I moved around. The biggest part of my life was being married to Carl and being part of the Army, the war. I mean, it was real. It was real.
Yeah.
No gas, couldn't do things. Not much money. And we lived in 44. Was when they were planning this invasion, and he and a major and a colonel were sent up to Skyline Drive to set up this camp to train these kids. So that's when I quit my job and moved up to Luray, because then I would see him on the weekends. That's all I'd see him up there. And then the plan changed about the African invasion. So you see, all this is tied up in your life, part of it.
Yeah.
And so the colonel, the major, and Carl was the captain. Those three people were in charge of those camps. They were told to leave the mountains and the snow and the cold and move to Fort Lee in Virginia and have that kind of training, land training.
Okay.
So he called me out and said, in the meantime, I was living in a boarding house up there, the three women. And furniture, I think we had a little bit of furniture. He called and I said, now go to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and find yourself a place to live. Because he was going to Fort Lee.
Right.
And he didn't know when he'd see me again.
Okay. Wow.
See, because this is times were tense, you see, at that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyway, I moved to Fredericksburg, and he went to Fort Lee, and that's where we were when the war ended.
Okay. So, was it a happy time after the war ended, with all the tension gone? Was it quite a release to finally celebrate the end?
What I remember, I was in this apartment in Fredericksburg, and we had a car. We had an old car. So many things I can't remember anymore. He came home, we sold our stuff, and I can't remember what in the world we did with our furniture. We must have put it in storage. Moved out of the apartment, got in the car. He wanted to take me south. See, I'd never met any of his people, and I'd never been south, really. So we got in the car with our little a bit of money, and we went south. We eventually went all the way to Key West on that trip.
Wow.
And I don't know how much time then so I met his family, and we had a good time going to. They were happy times.
Yeah.
And she showed me where he had lived in Florida, St. Simons and Sea Island, and so then when we came back, we went to Washington, straight to Washington.
Okay. And where did you live in Washington?
Well, the government made a statement that they had to give these boys, these men who had served and been drafted, they had to take them back at a job comparable to what they had. Well, as I just got through telling you, Carl was an assistant messenger, which was the lowest thing on the pay scale.
Mm-hmm.
But he was entitled to that. But so we came back, and he reported back to agriculture, and we couldn't find a place to. Where did I stay in those few days? I don't remember where we stayed, but along the Memorial Highway between Washington and where the airport is now,
Mm-hmm.
they built a row of like motel-like houses.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only place you could get was one of those. They were like I'm living in now, one room on like a strip mall, but they were very cheaply built. So he went back to work, and we got one of those places we lived in. Well, I lasted about 1 week in that with nothing to do in those four walls. And the final straw was it had an ice box.
Uh-huh.
One morning I was